Josh has us in the middle of a series called Making Space. First week, he was addressing the space between our ears. I would like to think that between my ears I do have some brain matter. My wife was here, she would dispute that. Last week, Josh was challenging us on how much stuff do we need? And that realization that everything we have belongs to God. I recall back in San Diego at a church, one of our deacons was up to share during the offering. And I could relate to this because I had to share a bedroom with my older brother. And as my siblings would grow up and move out of the house, it gave us opportunity as time went on that we get the room of our own. Well, Mark had shared this opportunity when that happened in his home, that his older brother went into a room of his own, and Mark grabbed something that was sharp, probably a screwdriver, can't recall what he used, and he promptly went around the room etching everything with his name. Furniture, headboard, whatever. He quickly learned that that was not his. His parents had something to say about that. Last week, Josh also challenged us with how we often become very envious of what others have, regardless of how they required it, that sometimes we make those comparisons. It's like, God, why don't we have it? So sometimes that will motivate us to go out and acquire things on our own. So we'll buy. But quite often we will do this decision with not having the resources to do it. So quite often we will acquire debt to accumulate things. Proverbs warns us on things like that. It says, the blessings of the Lord makes a person rich and adds no sorrow to it. The problem, as maybe some of us can understand, the issues that accumulating debt as we accumulate other things, the burden that puts on us. And sometimes that burden becomes something that will distract us from what is truly important in our life, of maybe even our relationship with God. Josh again challenged us on this, is that to have that understanding is that we need to understand where we are financially. So we should do a balance sheet. Where's our assets and our liabilities? But more importantly, we should come up with a budget. Okay, I'm looking at Tracy here. We know that's the B word, right? Tracy and I did a personal Christian financial classes for many years at Table Rock. We hope to come up with a new version of that here at Grace Point here shortly. But we know the budget, we refer to it as a B word because it has negative connotations. In reality, what you want to come up with a spending plan. You want to know where you're at before you can go out and accumulate. And unfortunately, as a society, Americans, Josh shared again a statistic that we spend 103% of what we earn. We should be saving something, but we don't. We spend. Because we're on this path of accumulation. And so, why do we do that? Do we lack faith that God's going to provide for our needs? That we need to intercept His plan and He needs our help. So we're going to go on our own tangent of acquiring things. So the question I have is, where is our faith? What occupies the space between your ears? Is faith a condition of the heart, or is it a condition of the brain? Does the brain dictate to the heart, or does the heart dictate to the brain? And repeat that. Think about that for a second. Does the brain dictate the heart, or does the heart dictate to the brain? Does the lack of faith drive a desire to consume, a drive for instant gratification, or a need to accumulate. Matthew tells us that wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. Think that for a second, how this all fits in together. That where our treasures are, if we're out accumulating, are we putting, is that the desires of our heart to accumulate? Do we not trust God to provide? So the challenge is, where's our faith? Again in Matthew we read, you don't have enough faith. We all struggle with this. Jesus told them, I tell you the truth, if you had faith of even as small as a mustard seed, you could say to the mountain, move from there to here. And it would move. Nothing would be impossible. Faith is a funny thing. And as we know, this series is about stewardship and money. And what is money? We just have to have an understanding of what money is before we can move on. Money's just a method of storing value. We all go off to work. In turn for working, we get a paycheck that's representing dollars. These dollars just represent the worth of a day's labor. So the question is, where do we store this money? Where do we have our faith? As we know, recent headlines, we put our money in a bank. Banks aren't always necessarily as safe as we like to think they are. Consequently, is that we then have to decide, do we put it under our mattress or do we trust the bank? Well, we trust the bank because the Federal Reserve, is going to insure up to $250,000 of our account. So are we then taking our faith and trust from the bank and transferring this to the feds, to the government? So the challenge we have there is, again, if you watch the news, which I have to admit I have an addiction, I'm trying to break that because it gets very depressing, especially on things like this, is, a long story short, the issue that brought this most recent bank down is they did a very conservative investment on where they were putting their reserve funds, but they were negatively impacted because the feds had to raise interest rates to try to keep inflation down. Inflation is, by definition, too much money chasing too few goods. As we know, electric officials in Washington like to spend, and they continue to spend. So this is sort of like, from the federal government spending plan, is you have the feds on a tandem bike, they got the handbrakes applied full force. Well, we got Congress on the back pedaling like crazy. So you have this conflicting thing going on. That also applies to us as individuals. Where do we have our faith? Do we have faith in what God's going to provide for us? Or are we going to help God along and we're going to make our own decisions based upon how we see things? So we're in the same situation. We're going to have this conflict in our lives of not having unified direction in what God's calling us to do. It comes down to this, as simply says as where do we put our faith? Do we have faith in what we have, or are we faithful with what we have? Again, let me say that again. Do we have faith in what we have, or are we faithful with what we have? We mentioned the spending plan. I personally make a spending plan because it gives me direction. Direction to do what? To accomplish a goal. We do the same thing here with the finances of the church. We did the same thing for Night to Shine. We had a goal. how do we achieve that objective of a goal without having a plan to achieve it? So a budget, a spending plan, is nothing more than a path giving you direction on how to achieve the goal. So the challenge is for us as Christians is, where do we put our faith? Who are we allowing to establish these goals in our life? One of my go-to expressions that I live by, I think it has a lot of deep meaning because it applies in so many areas. And it's a quote from Larry Paquette. And it says, if you don't establish a standard of living for your family, others will. Think of it, folks. If we don't have a goal established in our life, others will. And it's very subtle. It will come through something as simple of being envious of what a neighbor has. I want that too. But that may not be of value to you if it's not helping you achieve a goal. Well, if you don't have a goal, guess what? You're going to just be out accumulating without having any purpose. The shiny things of this world sometimes are blessings. They are provided by God, but they're only a blessing if it allows you to achieve a goal. Every now and then it's okay to take a little diversion, that you need a break from things. But if you're constantly allowing yourself to be diverted from a goal, you're never going to achieve it. So, what do? I'm going to have you turn to Genesis chapter 6. And it's the title of my message today is, it's a wealth of wisdom. We want to build like Noah, a man of faith. Starting in verse 9, we pick up that this is an account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man and the only blameless person living on earth at that time, and he walked in close fellowship with God. Noah was the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now God saw that the earth had become corrupt and was filled with violence. God observed all this corruption in the world, for everyone on earth was corrupt. So God said to Noah, I have decided to destroy all living creatures, for they have filled the earth with violence. Yes, I will wipe them out along with the earth. Build a large boat from cypress wood and waterproof it with tar, inside and out. Then construct decks and stalls throughout the interior. Make the boat 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Leave an 18-inch opening below the roof all the way around the boat. Put a door on the side and build 3 decks inside the boat, lower, middle, and upper. So, what do we see right here? God has given not only a purpose, but has given Noah a plan. It's like he had incentive. God came to him and said, I'm going to destroy the world. We've seen a world that has gone bad. So let's look at the context in which God is delivering these instructions to Noah. Going back to the beginning of Genesis 6, back in verse 1, we see, then the people began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw the beautiful women and took any they wanted as their wives. So I want to stop there for a second so you understand what's going on here. This is about 10 generations away from Adam and Eve. And we have Noah is a descendant of Seth. So the issue that's going on here behind the scenes is that we also have the descendants of Cain. Remember, Cain was excommunicated for his sin, for killing Abel. So God did not want the two to intermix. So this was the foundation for where God's seeing this perceived evil that's happened in the earth. So when you see this, God is now upset with this, and we see it again in Proverbs 29:16. When the wicked are multiplied, transgression increases. So this is what's getting God upset. The world has not gone the way he had hoped. He's allowed it, but now he's going to put an end to it. So picking up again in verse 3, we have the Lord said, "My spirit will not put up with humans for such a long time, for they are only mortal flesh. In the future, their normal lifespan will be no more than 120 years. In those days, and for some time after, giant Nephites lived on the earth, and for whenever the sons of God had intercourse with women, they gave birth to children who became the heroes and famous warriors in ancient times." God observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they brought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. So the Lord was sorry that he ever made them and put them on the earth. It broke his heart. And the Lord said, "I will wipe this human race I have recreated from the face of the earth. Yes, I will destroy every living thing, all the people, the large animals, and the small animals that scurry along the ground, and even the birds in the sky. I am sorry I have ever made them." But Noah had found favor with the Lord. So there's the key. Is in the context of Noah seeking God's will in his life, that God decided to spare him. In Proverbs again, we see this, that for many are the plans of a person's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. So through this, using Noah that's seeking God's will in his life, is given purpose to what Noah is doing. Picking back up in Genesis now in verse 17, "Look," God says, "I'm about to cover the earth with a flood that will destroy every living thing that breathes. Everything on earth will die, but I will confirm my covenant with you. So enter the boat, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring a pair of every kind of animal, a male and a female, into the boat with you, and keep them alive during the flood. Pairs of every kind of bird, every kind of animal, and every kind of small animal that scurries along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. And be sure to take on board enough food for your family and all the animals." So we have the plan, but now we have God saying, "Save for tomorrow." It's the wise man that saves for the future. It's the foolish man that spends whatever he gets. Another quote from Proverbs. But let's sit back and look now. Let's tear apart what's going on with Noah. Noah is building this boat. We don't know the exact time or how much time it took Noah to construct this boat, but we know it took a huge commitment. Noah had to be focused on what he was doing to construct this boat. He was not allowed to be distracted from what the purpose that God has given him. Through his faith, he had purpose, and he coordinated the resources that God has given him. Think in those times, probably most everything that he needed to construct the ark was something that he provided through himself or through his family. Manpower probably constructing the tools. They were gathering the food that would need for this long time, that they were unknown time at that point of how long they were needed to feed the animals in themselves. But I want you to think in terms of the commitment that Noah was making. The timeline that he was involved was probably equivalent to our lifetime. That when we seek God's will in our life, when we have our faith and trust in God, it's a lifetime commitment. Just as what we see here with Noah. Probably 70 years, my best guess, is what Noah took, minimum, to build the ark. It was a lifetime commitment. That's the example that Noah gives us. God provided, and Noah stayed on track for what God wanted him to do. It's the commitment that Noah had that allowed him, in spite of his faults, to achieve the goal. If you read further on in Genesis, you'll find out that Noah had faults. But we see in Genesis 6 that Noah stayed faithful for this, because in verse 22 it says, "So Noah did everything exactly as God had communicated to him." So, the thing is, when we find and try to put our faith in God, we have to understand what God's purpose is for us. If we don't understand what God's purpose is in our life, we're going to struggle to, what are we saving for? What's the plan? So the bottom line comes down to faith. Recap, again, is if you don't have faith, we're going to be on our own trying to figure out what purpose we have and what are we saving for. If we don't have a goal, we're going to spend everything today and not have anything for the future. It's that we need to commit our actions to the Lord. In your plans will succeed, we read in Psalm 16:3. We have to have purpose, or we're going to be just wandering around in the desert without having any purpose on what we're to do with what God has blessed us with. And again, we have to consider what God wants of us. Again, come up with the plan, have the faith, and understand what we're saving for. The final part of what we have here is, what do we give back to God? Proverbs 3:9-10 says, "Honor the Lord with your wealth, and with the best part of everything you produce. Then he will fill your barns with grain, and your vats will overflow with good wine." Understand, when God was calling Noah to build the ark, God wasn't calling him to do something that he was not capable of doing. God is only going to hold us responsible for those things that he has entrusted with us. So, another way of putting it is that it doesn't matter what you have, it matters what you do with what you have. Think of it, all the resources that God had commanded, had given Noah and his family, would have done Noah no good during the flood. It was the plan that God gave Noah to take all those resources, save them, invest them, build in the ark that allowed him to be saved from the flood. Again, it's that purpose in life of what God's called us to do that is going to allow our resources that God has blessed us with to be successful, that will allow us to get through the calamities of life. It didn't matter what Noah had, it mattered what he did with what he had. In Malachi 3:10, we have a similar situation here. This is the last book of the Old Testament. In Genesis, obviously the first book. Isn't it interesting, if you know Malachi, that God is struggling with his creation. They have gone on their own. They have turned their backs on God. And we see same thing here in Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. We'll read here in verse 10, where Malachi is urging them to bring all their tithes into the storehouses so there'll be enough food in my temple. If you do, says the Lord of heaven, I will open the windows of heaven for you. I will pour out a blessing so great that you won't have enough room to take it all in. Try it. Put me to the test. This is the only time God has asked us to test him. Your crops will be abundant, for I will guard them from insects and disease. Your grapes will not fall from your vine before they are ripe, says the Lord. Then all nations will call you blessed, for your land will be such a delight, says the Lord. So again, think again, here we are at the end of the Old Testament, and we're still dealing with the same issues when God had approached Noah that he's going to have to destroy mankind. The issues are the same. It's the same issues that we're struggling with today. We see God, again, his provision for Noah, having the understanding of what God is calling for him to do in his life, having purpose. Here we see Malachi reaching out to another lost generation, saying, test God, have faith in God, that if you can't outgive him, is again, faith in trust in God. Malachi rebuked the people and the priests for neglecting the worship of God and failing to live according to his will. Again, no faith. The priests were corrupt. They had no leadership. How could they lead the people? They had become stumbling blocks instead of spiritual leaders. So again, folks, where are you getting your spiritual leadership from? Where are you getting leadership from? Period. If you have not sought God and God's will in your life, you're going to be susceptible to the whims of the flesh. You're going to be into the consumption. You're going to be looking for the instant gratification because you're lacking purpose. And you're not going to achieve purpose until you understand what God has called you to do, and that's faith. Malachi goes on saying that the men were divorcing their wives and marrying pagan women. How could they have godly children in that situation? Their relationship with God had become inconsequential. And that's the challenge, folks, is that as we accumulate, as we get further off the path of what God has intended us to do, our relationship with God becomes unimportant. So right now we need to take stock in ourselves to understand what is driving us. What sinful habits are allowing us or inhibiting us to have that unadulterated faith in God and who God says he is? That we need to give up the consumption, the materialism, the instant gratification. We live in a pleasure-sought society where everything is that gratification where we want to enjoy everything. Well, God's going to give us joy. We just need to understand what he's calling us to do. And again, this is not to say that God's not going to bless us with joy, because everything that God provides is meant to be a blessing. But not everything that we have is going to be a blessing to us if it's not going to achieve the goal that God has in our lives. At the mere least, it's going to be a distraction from us achieving a long-term goal. And it's okay. It's okay occasionally to have those distractions, but if we don't have purpose, we're going to allow those distractions to become the norm. So we need to be putting the Lord first, and by giving God our best. Each day we need to be seeking God. We need to be seeking God's will in our life. We need to live our lives showing and demonstrating our faith that we believe who God says he is. Let's go back tonight to shine. So, here we are that Friday. I got the keys to the kingdom. The event went off, as we saw. It was a wonderful event, and obviously it was through the efforts of so many people. It was on Monday when they had the opportunity to return the keys, and I shared with the administrator at First Baptist how humble I was by the fact that they would entrust us with the keys to their kingdom. Their response was even more humbling when they said they would not have done that with anybody. What was so humbling about that, folks, is the understanding that God's not going to entrust us with his kingdom unless we prove faithful in the smaller things. So consequently, I was even more humbled as leaving the building that day that through everything that had happened, 600 individuals, multiple organizations, that we were able to be entrusted with something bigger. And that's for us as individuals, is to understand that we're not going to be entrusted with the bigger things until we prove to be faithful in the smaller things. Let's go ahead and close in prayer.